All right, everyone, welcome to our May Lunch and Learn on Marine Resources Council's Progress Report. Thank you so much for joining us here today in person and on Zoom as well. My name is Caitlin Bagnall. I am an environmental educator here at MRC, and this is Jim Moyer. He is our interim executive director, as well as our chairman of our board of directors. So I'll get a little bit more in depth into Jim's bio in a little bit, but first, just a couple of things to take care of. First, a little housekeeping for our audience in person. You guys have all received note cards and pencils. Please feel free to write any questions that you have throughout the presentation on those note cards. We're going to pick them up at the end of the presentation and we will get those read out for you so Jim can answer them. If you are on Zoom and you have any questions, please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A. The chat has been disabled, so please make sure that you direct your questions towards the Q&A instead. And of course, please silence all your cell phones too. Something that's very important to remember to do unless you want everyone to stare at you during the middle of the presentation. So what's going on here at MRC? So right now we have lots of volunteer opportunities for you. The first one that's coming up is this Friday. We have our monthly First Friday Litter Patrol to help keep our campus beautiful. We also have our mangrove workshop on Saturday the 13th. That is going to be located this month at the MRC St. Sebastian River Greenway Nursery. And of course, we also have storm drain marking opportunities. This is a really cool initiative that we have with the cities of Cocoa and Melbourne to be able to bring awareness to everything that goes down the storm drain goes into the lagoon. So we need help marking those storm drains to raise awareness for the public. If you'd like to become a volunteer and volunteer for any of those opportunities, please email me, Caitlin at mrcirl.org. And I know there's a million ways to spell Caitlin. It is C-A-I-T-L-I-N. So contact me if you want to get involved. All right, and then I'm going to introduce Jim here. So Jim Moyer is a husband and father. He's a Florida native and has been a resident of Stewart for 31 years. Jim is civically engaged and passionate about protecting the IRL and its coastal margins. He's currently the chairman of the board of directors for the MRC and our interim executive director. He's been an appointee to the Martin County Local Planning Agency. He's the newest Indian River keeper and a member of the leadership team of the Rivers Coalition. Jim also facilitates ocean science projects, specializing in bioacoustics, marine animal surveys, and the deployment of autonomous vehicles and data collection devices. He's currently involved with several citizen sciences projects and marine mammal stranding networks. He often volunteers with coastal restoration efforts and exotic species control programs as well. So without further ado, here is Jim. Thanks for being here, Jim.
It's sort of like my second home. And thank you all for being here. Brevard County is a special place, and it has a special place in my heart because it extends so far up and down the Indian River Lagoon. The Indian River Lagoon is still the most biodiverse estuary in North America. It's lost a lot of that luster, but I don't think anybody else can make that claim. So for now, it's still the most biodiverse estuary in North America. A lot of the reason perhaps that some of the species may not be here any longer is that it's no longer the ideal place for them to migrate to. The Marine Resources Council for many years was doing a report card, and it was looking at water quality up and down the lagoon based on sort of the state's criteria of water quality. And as the lagoon's health started to fail, we found ourselves giving really failing marks for much of the lagoon. And over time, we witnessed the lagoon's health as terms of water quality somewhat improving, but the habitat was not. And in order to inspire some optimism and also to give people a hopeful perspective on what could be done to make our position in the lagoon's health more beneficial, we decided to produce a progress report for 2023. And the idea of a progress report was to give you all an idea of some of the things that are being done in the lagoon to make it a better place and a healthier place, and also to dive a little deeper into what could be done to improve the lagoon's health, and also what we as citizens living along the lagoon in 5 different counties can do to goad our legislators as well as ourselves into a better symbiotic relationship with the lagoon. And so we have developed this progress report for you all. This is a beautiful photograph taken by our development director of the Melbourne Bridge. This is what it could be. This is a healthy seagrass bed. The normal progression for seagrasses from the little sprigs into a meadow like that of turtle grass would be about 10 years. But you got to get the conditions right for those little grasses to start to develop and then grow through a progression of different species until you get healthy, productive seagrass meadows. This is our primary donors. The Gillespie Foundation started helping us fund the report card, and several of these other groups have done a really wonderful job in helping us move along. I have to particularly thank the Scaddens who are working with us on restoration. These are members of the board and as well as donors. You all deserve a great deal of thanks for doing that, as do you all who are sitting in this room. Each of those individuals cares enough with their pocketbook, cares enough with their time and their effort, and has a belief that we can collectively make the lagoon a healthier place. We just need the commitment of each of us to do what we can, both on our land occupations and in our habitations, as well as the way we vote. Today's presentation and the presentation of the progress report is made possible by these individuals and their foundations. And a great deal of thanks to each of those. Ron John has come on specifically. Northrop Grumman is doing a fantastic job of helping us. Several of those are also board members and funders for the Marine Resources Council. River Oak Dental is doing some terrific work here. All of these groups deserve a great deal of credit for their thoughtfulness as well as their generosity.
And Jim, if someone wanted to get on one of these lists, who would they contact?
Well, Ken Parks would probably be the perfect person to contact. Ken Parks is our development director. He's sitting in the back of the room. You can contact the Marine Resources Council, and we would gladly direct either your directed contribution or your general contribution to one of the many projects that we have going at the Marine Resources Council. Our dedication to community engagement is 2 years?
Yep.
That's a long time in a community. And I think that, our progress has been through citizen science and working with the adults in the community as well as the children in the community to communicate science principles and to make the connection between land-based operations and the aquatic environment. And it's something that I think the Floridians need to really consider every day. What we do on the land has a direct influence on what happens in the lagoon. Every canal is connected. The canalization of the east coast of Florida has made the watershed of the Indian River Lagoon all the way to Orlando, basically, in terms of what happens in the central spine of the state of Florida is now flowing into the Indian River Lagoon and the other lagoons on the east coast of Florida. So the enlargement of that watershed has made what had been a nutrient limited ecosystem one that evolved a vast variety of species to accommodate just the production, the primary producers of seagrasses and macroalgae as being the primary glucose source in the whole ecosystem, to what has become a eutrophic system where there is way too much nutrients coming from literally all over the world, the fertilizers that we consume, and our biological effluent ends up being a collection of nutrients and energy from all over the planet. And that's all ending up in the lagoon. And that's shifted the system into a system whose primary producers are now the algae, the phytoplankton that lives within the water column, from a bottom-based system into a nutrient-based system in the lagoon itself. And then as those algae die, they become consumed by bacterium, and that muck flux is now what we're seeing in terms of a algal bloom and bust, and then a lack of oxygen in the system and fish kills and other negative responses. And so we need to somehow break that cycle. I was sharing with Caitlin earlier the idea of a person that has an eating disorder that has become morbidly obese and has a sweet tooth. And so this person has now lost a kidney and half their liver. And we're now going to give that patient a gastric bypass surgery. And so we're going on a severe diet. We're limiting some of the nutrients by switching from septic to sewer systems, by limiting some of our stormwater treatment areas and the nutrient inflow into the lagoon. But we need to also give that patient some behavioral modifications. And that's where our part in this comes. We need to modify some of our negative behaviors that are not allowing this patient to recover into a healthy condition. And if we don't do that, we can almost guarantee that that patient is going to remain on an intensive care until it really does go beyond the point of return. And we can't afford to do that because we depend on this patient's survival, not only for our personal survival, but our economic survival. So slowing the flow is the way we can do that. By reducing the inrush of these nutrients, by allowing nature to uptake some of those nutrients in slowing the stormwater flow, slowing the groundwater flow. Contemplate what the system had been like 7,000 years ago. The only inputs were from nitrogen from the rain. The state of Florida has surplus phosphates in its soil. We actually export phosphates. I think we're only second to Morocco in terms of exporting phosphates to the rest of the globe for fertilizer. So our soils are saturated with phosphates. We need no extra phosphates in our nutrient systems to make the vegetation healthy. But the nitrogens were coming from the atmosphere, coming from groundwater, coming from the tributaries. Now we've exploded and expanded those tributaries to being more than half the state of Florida. So we need to reduce the speed that those nutrients get to the watershed. We need to allow more vegetative space. We need to buy more land for conservation. We need to protect our wetlands now more than ever, because so many of them have been bulldozed and so many of them have been filled and so many of them have become sort of the terminal crop. So what we did for agriculture by creating these canals is now unfortunately likely to become housing developments And the terminal crop will be a housing development rather than a citrus grove. So we need to be really careful about those nutrient inputs that we put in, as well as our sewage treatment facilities. We need to be careful about the fertilizers we apply, the fertilizers we allow our municipalities to apply, and also be aware of all of the other chemicals that are man-made that are going into those applications, the herbicides and pesticides, some of the plastics that we're creating. You know, as we move from septic to sewer, we need to be aware of what happens to the wastewater, to the recycled water, what happens to that purple pipe. If we are taking ourselves off a septic system and using reuse water to irrigate with, what level of nutrients have been removed from that reused water? Are we actually potentially creating another problem by using reuse water that is not fully denitrified? The answer is some of the experiments show that, yeah, we are actually going to cause as much of a nutrient input as we had when we were on a septic system. So we need to move into this 21st century very carefully, very thoughtfully, and to demand clean water from our legislature. How do we get in the know? We're curious people. I mean, the reason you're here is that you're curious. I urge you to be skeptical, but also to demand answers. Don't just say that it's going to be great if we follow this regimen. An example is that the state set up these basin management action plans to reduce the nutrient loads into the IRL to meet TMDLs, or total maximum daily loads of different water quality chemistry. And so the TMDLs are set up in order to reduce the nutrient levels within the lagoon to a range which will benefit the ecology of the lagoon, specifically seagrasses. Clearly, that's working a little bit, but not enough. The way we've set it up is so that those TMDLs, as we approach them, should create a system, an ecological system that allows the seagrasses to live in a healthy state. They're not in a healthy state, and those BMAPs will probably have to be adjusted. On the land use side, the non-point source deposition of pollutants is regulated by best management practices, and those are completely voluntary and are clearly not satisfactory. Not enforcing the regulations that are on the book is not a way to get a good and healthy outcome for the general society. I think that we need to hold the state DEP accountable for not regulating what they are empowered to regulate. We need to give them enough money to do that, but we also may need to look at other ways of requiring them to do their work. We need to require the Florida Department of Agriculture to regulate those non-point discharges in the agricultural lands. I live in Stewart, and so much of what we're concerned about is what comes out of Lake Okeechobee through the St. Lucie Canal and into the southern 10 miles of the 156 miles of Indian River Lagoon. That is a massive problem for the southern end of the lagoon, but that is not necessarily what's affecting up here. It probably was the beginning. Probably agriculture and the soil problems on agricultural properties up in Brevard County was the problem, but up in Brevard County, the problem now is urban development and how we manage our own effluents and how we manage our own stormwater systems. Brevard County is doing a great job with soil. Soil is doing a terrific job of managing that, and it needs to be reinstated. I think that other counties up and down the lagoon can learn a lot from how Brevard County has taxed itself in order to take accountability for its own inputs. Martin County's issues are negotiating with the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District to get reductions in outflows from Lake Okeechobee, and they're doing a pretty good job. St. Lucie County is doing a fabulous job of slowing down the flow in the North Fork of the St. Lucie River by recreating oxbows that had been straightened, very much like the Kissimmee River into the north end of Lake Okeechobee was straightened by the Army Corps and then landscaped in order to accommodate slowing the flow and allowing nature to sequester and pull out some of those nutrients before they ended up in the lake. Unfortunately, the lake has many, many feet of extra nutrients and muck that end up being discharged out to the east and the west. The Caloosahatchee River is suffering probably as many slings and arrows as the St. Lucie is. And what we need to do is get the water to go south. So we need to pressure the Everglades agricultural area to allow more water through that agricultural area. We need to force the sugar growers and some of the agricultural interests there to take accountability for their own water. So rather than pumping their irrigation water and their flooded field water that is polluted with nutrients back into a reservoir that you all are paying for, we need to require the agricultural interests to take accountability for their own polluted water and have stormwater treatment areas on their property so that those stormwater treatment areas that are publicly owned can be used to denitrify the Lake Okeechobee water that needs to go south to recharge the South Florida aquifer, to give Florida Bay the fresh water that it needs, the Everglades National Park the water that it needs, but it needs to be clean and it needs to be denitrified and have the phosphate levels reduced to less than 10 parts per million. Indian River County, the St. Sebastian River is a beautiful, wonderful resource. It has its own growth issues. It has its own sewage treatment facility issues, but it's taking those by the horns, and it's doing some really pretty amazing projects to switch from septic to sewer, to have some stormwater treatment areas that are really functioning wetlands, which is really nature's way of dealing with this problem. St. Lucie County also is doing, it's taking its wastewater treatment facility off the island and moving it inland, which is a really important and useful move. Volusia County has agreed to some really important principles. It's not necessarily following the same track as some of the other counties to the south, but it's doing a really good job. Organizations, not just municipalities, are doing really amazing work at communicating to the public and also getting grants to do really important restorative work within the lagoon. The IRL NEP as sort of the central organizing force for that is funded through the EPA, the DEP, the St. John's Water Management District, and the South Florida Water Management District, as well as the 5 counties that line the 156 miles of lagoon, is organizing, has got a plan. The plan has been agreed to by all of those agencies and municipalities, as well as many of the other citizens groups that are aligned with the IRL NEP. And given the chance, it will work. It will reduce the nutrient loads into the lagoon to a point where it can start to recover. But the recovery of the lagoon is not straightforward. It's not going to be an instantaneous action that's going to suddenly have seagrasses. And we can't plant our way out of this problem. We're talking about 350 square miles, you know, at $100,000 an acre for seagrass restoration. We can't plant our way out of that. We may have lost 95% of the seagrass biomass in the lagoon. This is a really serious problem that's going to take really serious effort and a long time to start to recover. And the seagrass is the keystone species that we need to talk about. The charismatic animal, the manatee that we're all really concerned about. And quite honestly, I'm very concerned about the manatee. We can't afford another 2,000 manatees starving to death, but we need to be really rational about how we manage that species. I personally think we need to understand that we're no longer in a geologic time period that is predictable. We are now in a time period that man's influence has made unpredictable. We are in the Anthropocene, and our management strategies for the environment need to be flexible enough to accommodate an uncertainty that in decades past we could accommodate. We could assume that the ecosystem would react in a way that was predictable. And I'm not convinced that we can any longer assume that this ecosystem is going to respond in a terribly predictable way, because the variables are so large and so unpredictable. And we are the biggest variable in that equation. You know, 1,100 people a day may be moving into the state of Florida. How we plan for that is something that we have to take the natural systems into account for. And so far, municipal planning doesn't do that terribly well. If we start to contemplate sea level rise and climate change as part of that, we can see that we're really behind the eight ball. We live in a state that's very low, that's full of water, that really requires some very careful planning and some very careful self-regulation in order to live in some sort of harmony with that. This is what we've been talking about. The green line would indicate the target. The blue line indicates water quality as assessed by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And the red line is the habitat or the seagrass health as measured by the St. John's Water Management District, as well as the South Florida Water Management District. The green line target are the TMDLs. The blue graph is the water quality, and you can see that each of those dips corresponds to weather events as well as algal blooms, and the red line is seagrass health. Now, whether the National Marine Fisheries Service believes it or not, there is direct correlation between seagrass health and fisheries. It's imperative that we get the seagrasses to come back so that our fisheries can come back, so that our oysters and clams can come back. But the seagrass health also relies on the soil's health. And so the rhizomal community, or the rhizomal sphere, the life forms that live within the root systems of those seagrasses also have to be healthy enough to live in a fragile balance with the other predators and prey in that ecosystem. And so we have to get the soil chemistry right and the water quality chemistry right in order for the seagrasses to thrive and for the other organisms that live within that community to be right. And we have to remember that we're part of that community too. We rely on it not only for the money that we can extract from that as an economy, we rely on that not only for the economy that we can extract from the tourism and from the real estate value and from the physical beauty, but also our spiritual connection to that. We need to live in a healthy environment in order to be connected to each other and connected to our surroundings. And we're all here because it's beautiful. We're all here because the climate is nice, the people are pretty nice, and the river is a delight. I find rebirth every time I get wet out there, and I hope you all do too. And it's important to be able to be healthy enough to be wet, to enjoy this place as we are bound to. I moved here from Key Biscayne. I grew up on what had been a coconut plantation with a bright turquoise bay as my playground. The sublime beauty that captivated me by the St. Lucie estuary took some time. I had to get used to the brown water. I had to get used to the coral reef that was a little different. But I have completely fallen in love with it. And I want your backyard to be as healthy as it can be. And we need to get the red line to correspond with the blue line. And we need to think purple, because if we don't, our lifestyles are going to have to change dramatically. And I think with a little bit of behavioral modification, we can get there.
Jim, can I ask you a question really quick?
Certainly.
You touched on coral reefs. How exactly does our lagoon's health relate to coral reef health?
Directly. As much as the lagoon's health relies on your land use patterns, the coral reefs and the nearshore system relies on the water quality that comes out of the estuaries and the inlets. And so in the St. Lucie estuary, we've got the northern end of the hard coral reef spur that runs all the way down through the Florida Keys to the Dry Tortugas. It is one of the longest and most critical barrier reefs in the world. Its health is directly related to the sediments and the nutrients that are flowing out of the St. Lucie estuary. The nearshore reef system is a little farther offshore up here, but is directly related to the inlets, both at Sebastian Inlet as well as Canaveral Inlet and also Ponce Inlet. The Fort Pierce Inlet is probably more directly related to the St. Lucie, northern end of the St. Lucie coral reef spur. But the sediments and the nutrients are directly relating to the coral health and those polyps' ability to feed and to be healthy. The fisheries, I mean, the seagrass health is a direct correlation to the fisheries health. The pinfish, pigfish that become the prey for the pelagic fish species that range up and down the east coast of the United States are here migrating in order to feed on those. Many, many, many of the fish species that live in the lagoon system and in the tributaries are endoronymous, so that they need to have freshwater and saltwater habitats. So they need to migrate through those estuary inlets, and they need to get offshore for part of their lifespan. Some of them are laying eggs in the saltwater, and then those fish are coming back into the freshwater to live. And many of them are the reverse. They need to come into the freshwater in order to spawn and then live their lives out in the saltwater. So there's a direct correlation to the fishery and to the coral health and all of the other incredible number of species that live in both those ecosystems. You know, one of the numbers is something like 657 fish species living in the southern end of the lagoon. You know, the Bahamas has only 300 fish species. That makes this place, the Indian River Lagoon, so geographically important and so geographically fragile. It's where the continental shelf meets the Gulf Stream. It's where the estuaries, where the freshwater meets the saltwater. It's where the tropics meets the subtropics. There's probably 10 different ecotones that end up colliding in this one spot that makes this biodiversity so incredibly wealthy. It is the treasure of the Treasure Coast. This biodiversity that is here is nowhere else on the planet. And we need to really be aware that that fragile ecosystem, the balance that allows that to happen, is entirely our responsibility. And as we develop a responsible relationship with that, we also need to be accountable for our inputs and our protections. And we need to spend whatever it takes to make that a healthy, symbiotic relationship. Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you. Please carry on.
Do you have any other questions?
No.
So, way to go, IRL NEP. You're doing good work. We need to keep it funded. We need to endorse it. We need to embrace its seagrass restoration efforts. We also need to embrace its shellfish aquaculture projects as well as its restoration projects. The filter feeders are going to do a good job of helping a healthier water quality, enabling a healthier water quality. A healthy adult oyster can filter about 50 gallons a day. A healthy clam can do an equal amount, maybe even more. We need to focus on clam and oyster restorations at the same time as these seagrass restorations, and we need to get the quanta correct. We need to figure out how we replant both those groups. We also need to work on our shorelines to reduce the wave impacts and the sediment erosion on our shorelines, not by creating bulkheads and vertical engineered structures. We need to work on living shorelines that can slow the flow, reduce the nutrients, absorb the wave energy, prepare ourselves for sea level rise and storm impacts, and also to allow for a productive exchange of nutrients and food resources for a healthy ecosystem. And it can be beautiful as well as being effective and engineered. So St. John's Water Management District is doing a fabulous job of watching, maintaining, developing stormwater treatment areas that are denitrifying the systems. And we need to look to these experts for guidance, for the municipalities to look to them. They're also doing their very best to accommodate these basin management action plans and to get credits for denitrifying the system. And so the stormwater treatment facilities that are using aquatic vegetation to remove those nutrients are a way for them to get credits for the BMAPs. And so we need to have the nurseries that grow those seagrasses for them. We also need to allow them to have the land that they need to have in order to develop those stormwater treatment areas. And so if we allow the state to take funding away from conservation lands that we have agreed to provide funding for other restoration projects, we're not doing that land acquisition the service that it needs. And so we need to be a little skeptical about some of the proposals and where the funding comes from. So we need to remember the Florida Clean Waters Act is doing a really good job of focusing attention on the Northern IRL. The Southern IRL SERP projects are being funded. They are large sort of Army Corps of Engineers, water management projects. The municipalities are filling in the gaps, but we need to be aware as citizens of where those are. And we need to, volunteer our efforts as well as provide the funding for those local municipalities to do the work that they know they can do. And so part of it is voting. Part of it is being aware. Part of it is volunteering your time and endorsing the local authorities that know what the projects that they can participate in are, as well as where their local fundings are coming from. And part of that is embracing the comprehensive plans that the agencies and the municipalities have, but also making sure that the state doesn't influence them in a sort of an overreach of state authority over local control. There are some really bad bills in Congress right now that you need to be aware of, and that you probably need to ask the governor to veto, or else your local authority to control some of those will be taken away from you. Low impact development. Low impact development can also be considered green infrastructure. It is a way for homeowners and individuals and individual developments to, rather than relying on a municipal stormwater treatment facility, to manage your stormwater inputs into the larger lagoon. And so the techniques are slowing the flow on your property, allowing the accumulation of stormwater and rainwater to not leave your property, to use it for irrigation, to use it to enhance your property, as well as softscaping your landscape. And so more percolation, more pervious property, more green around your house, more trees to uptake those nutrients. Lawns don't do a terribly good job of mimicking a natural habitat. They allow runoff to happen almost instantly. They don't absorb nutrients for terribly long. The clippings end up going into the roadways and or wherever else they're used. Trees live a long time, take up a lot of carbon, take up a lot of nutrients, provide shade, do the natural services that they were removed in order to accommodate the urban landscape. Golf courses are very intensely used for recreation, but also there are a lot of open space, not a lot of trees, a lot of lawn, a lot of landscape, a lot of terrascaping can probably hold water, but they are incredibly over fertilized. And so they need to be self-contained. And if they are flowing into a waterway, they are a culprit. Low impact design can accommodate recreation, but we need to think about how to incorporate our builtscape into a landscape that is native and natural. And the trees and vegetation that evolved to live in this landscape are particularly well adapted to it. Clearly, the invasion of exotic species is something that we have to deal with. It's an inevitability. As climate changes, we are going to see more of that. We're just going to have to be adaptive to that. But choose a native plant, choose a long-lived plant, choose one that is good for the fertilizers, good for the pollinators, good for absorbing the local nutrient loads, and also one that doesn't need to have any fertilizer inputs and pesticides. Remember, pesticides are forever chemicals that we're never going to get rid of. I think we've spoken about slowing the flow pretty well. Low impact development is something that the Marine Resources Council has been focused on for probably 7 to 9 years. We have had now 3 low impact design and development symposiums. We're going to have another one next fall. We've focused on design. We focused on sort of philosophy and concept. We've focused on municipal regulations, so the land development regulations, as well as the comprehensive plan policy. And now what we really need to do is focus on the developers and how to incorporate the low impact design into urban development. And I think we're going to get pretty good buy-in. In fact, I'm sure we're going to get good buy-in because it's a good way for them to somewhat greenwash their impact, but also to do their fair share. And I think many of the responsible developers are getting it, that they have a part to play, and you as a resident of an HOA have a part to play in forcing them to do the right thing and to develop a landscape that really is interactive with the community as well as the natural community. Be Floridian Now is a program that the Marine Resources Council is responsible for in Volusia County and in Martin County. There are sort of analogous programs in Brevard County as well as in St. Lucie County and Indian River County. The idea is to plant local indigenous plants that are well adapted to the area, that uptake carbon, uptake nutrients, don't require a lot of pesticides or fertilizers, and are good for you, good for the environment, and good for the pollinators. These are things that we should be doing normally and naturally. We should be accepting this as the Florida lifestyle rather than a mowed St. Augustine grass lawn, and nothing against pink flamingos, but they are a wetland species and don't belong on your lawn. I'm teasing, but somehow, someplace along in the 50s and 60s, there became this idea of what living in Florida is supposed to look like. And that's not a Floridian's perspective of the way Florida is supposed to look like. A Floridian's perspective of the way Florida is supposed to look like is the Everglades, or is a savanna, or is the coastal ridge. And it's got cabbage palms. It's a little bit brown. It is incredibly beautiful and fragile. And it's something that we as Floridians now should want. And I think that's a change in attitude and a change in behavior. And it's subtly beautiful. And I think that sometimes this dramatically Miami Vice sort of look isn't the way we really want to live, and isn't the way we can live in harmony with an ecosystem that's tragically very overpressured. The drain, I read that as drain the train. I'm having a personal debate with whether the train running through my community is a good thing or not. Your stormwater ends up in the lagoon, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. We need to reduce the negative impacts of our 21st century lifestyle into our stormwater. The petroleum products, the herbicides, the pesticides, the chemicals, the soaps, the plastics, the forever chemicals that we know of and those that we don't know of end up in our storm drains and end up into the lagoon and end up being apparent in the fish we eat, the shellfish that we don't eat, the other life forms that rely on the lagoon to live. You can dissect a life form from the lagoon and find plastics in virtually all of them. It has become a ubiquitous part of the ecosystem, and it is entirely our responsibility. And it is all of our use of these forever chemicals, or at least 50,000 years, that we are responsible for. I mean, it's interesting from somebody like me's perspective to think about how many of these hydrocarbons are that we use for energy, we use for 21st century lifestyle, end up becoming fundamentally part of the organisms that we rely on as food. And it's a really important thought to go from where we take our energy, where we take our supplies for the chemical industry, and look at where it ends up. It's part of our food web. And we're in the middle of that. We're actually also a consumer of that. And so, our part in this is part of a feedback loop that we're not always aware of. But you can actually look at your body, take a blood sample, and see ancient carbon that came from plastics and fertilizer that you are building your bodies out of. And we're taking the whole food web with us when we do that. And it's really kind of bleak when you see how dependent we are on that feedback loop from petroleum products through food. And there are lots of anecdotal stories that I'd be happy to share with you at some point about how that system works. But we really need to be aware of it. And if we're not familiar with our part in that feedback loop, we need to become familiar with it, because this is what's going to affect our great-grandchildren's health. And that's important. That's our legacy. If we kill the lagoon, that's on us and on our children. But our great-grandchildren rely on something even more important than that, and that is our ability to leave this place a better place than where we found it. And that's up to us.
Jim, are you aware of any current research that focuses on how to remove forever chemicals?
Some, I am also the Indian River Keeper, and the part of the Waterkeepers Alliance was to monitor PFAS in water bodies throughout the world. And PFAS is a class of chemical. You're probably most familiar with it as a flame retardant. It ends up having a forever half-life. Teflon is also one of those, and we all have cooked with Teflon-coated materials. That ends up being part of what we eat. It ends up being part of us. I did a project with a group that was collecting skin samples from sperm whales. And this is a bit of a divergence, but we were looking at what percentage of these sperm whales had, and sperm whales eat squid from the very bottom of the ocean, and they live all over the world. And we were collecting these from the most remote places you could imagine, from the Seychelles and from the South Pacific, as well as the Azores, and places really remote from land-based human occupation. Of the 970 samples that we collected, we had 100% detectable levels of persistent organic compounds in these skin samples, which means that these animals that are incredibly cryptic, incredibly diverse spread around the world, had measurable levels of persistent organic compounds that they were getting from the squid that they eat. So that's a measurement of the pervasiveness of it. I'll give you a little bit of hope. Somebody went back to the Charles W. Morgan, which is a whale ship that was placed in storage in 1935, and they tapped a cask in the hold, and they found persistent organic compounds from 1935. So some of these chemicals exist in nature. They do exist in nature, and so our ability to measure them or to detect them is gotten so good that we really don't know what the danger of chronic exposure is. We probably understand a little bit more about what the negative effects of I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of brain fade there, of current or dramatic, it'll come to me in a bit, exposure to one of these chemicals does. An acute exposure would probably be very negative, maybe inspire some cancer or some other negative health response. But the long-term chronic exposure is something that we really don't have a good handle on. We are livers. We live our lives filtering out everything. We're also seventh order predators. And so there is an equation of bioaccumulation that happens through the food web, and we are up on that scale. And so as a lower life form accumulates these toxins and these human created compounds, there is a bioaccumulation and also a biomagnification as it moves up the food web. So for instance, the dolphins in the Indian River Lagoon have some of the highest mercury levels measured in any marine mammal species on the planet. Where the mercury is coming from, it's not entirely clear, but it's probably from agriculture and through the waterways. There's also some evidence that some of the biochemistry that's happening in the soils as a product of the breakdown of the ecosystem is generating some of the hydrogen sulfide, which may actually be precipitating out some of the mercuries and becoming, some of the methyl mercury that we're getting into the food web. None of this is great news, but the answer is that once it's in you, you need to be as healthy as you can and dispose of it, as much of it as you can, keep your liver functioning well. But you got to rely on a healthy body to remove it. Unfortunately, one of the ways that female mammals get rid of some of these toxins is through their breast milk.
Yep.
Maverick, unfortunately,
yep,
whether you like it or not, is getting a dose of some of your lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And there are marine mammals that live in the Arctic that have levels of heavy metals and other organic compounds that are really unhealthy for acute exposure, but also clearly not for chronic exposures as well. And so I don't know, but if you were to collect a beluga whale, under Canadian law, you'd have to dispose of it in a toxic waste dump. This is how bad it is. This is not good news. You need to be aware that these are the impacts of what we as humans are doing. It's not natural for them to have to be exposed to that much heavy metal toxin.
Thank you.
Was that the answer?
I hope my liver is functioning well.
Well, I hope Maverick's being well. So, we have a really scary infant mortality rate in the dolphins in the IRL. Mm-hmm. Whether that leads to retardation, I don't know. but there is some evidence that the behaviors of these animals are being affected by their social structure breaking down because their health is breaking down. And we have to remember that as a species, we are a community, we are a society, and so are all the other living things that live on the planet. And so what we do as a species, what we do as an individual, what we do as an individual affects what we do as a society. What we do as a society affects what we do as a species. What we do as a species affects all the other communities that live on the planet with us. And it is really our accountability to do the best we can, not only for our children, but for every other species child. Communication is really important. I speak way too much. But we need to figure out a language that we can all understand. And we also need to be not afraid of the conversation. So I hear regularly that we mustn't talk about politics, religion, or the environment because it's just too hard. I don't know of anything more important to talk about than politics, religion, and the environment because they're connected. My spirituality comes from the environment that I live in. My ability to protect my right to my spiritual health and my societal health and my environmental health comes through my right to express myself politically. You have an obligation as informed citizens to vote. Vote your conscience, vote your mind. Don't allow yourself to be persuaded by hyperbole that doesn't make sense to you. If you don't understand something that is scientific, and I am not a scientist, I happen to facilitate science projects, and so I am aware of the jargon, but I'm a curious person. And so if I don't understand something, I'll ask Caitlin because she can explain it to me. We all have those people in our lives that can explain science principles to us more effectively than we can read or learn ourselves. We need to understand that the time is now to act with our children's, great-grandchildren's, and great-great-grandchildren's future in mind. Because if we don't have another choice. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to go off on another topic. I mean, I love this place a lot. And I was on a boat ride with some scientists that have been studying the Indian River Lagoon for about half of my life. And we were on a boat with a bunch of lawyers from Earth Justice who were contemplating a lawsuit against the EPA on behalf of the Save the Manatee Club. And I mentioned to Dr. Edie Witter, you know, what about having a national park that spanned the entire lagoon and the nearshore reef as a marine protected area? And so under that, you'd have federal funding, you'd have federal protection, you'd have the protection of the EPA that would create the water quality standards for the Indian River Lagoon rather than having the state do that. And maybe that would be a solution because I think that the system as it exists now is broken. And so these scientists sort of looked at me like I had that annoying third eye blinking away again. And it became sort of the mission for the year for the Indian River Keeper was to discover whether that was something that would work. The Biscayne National Park took about 10 years to get created with a lot of headwinds. Dante Fasal was sort of the chief legislative sponsor for that effort. I think that the nearshore reef, because we've spoken about it today, is connected to the Indian River Lagoon, deserves the protection of a marine protected area, should be part of that wet national park that is the Indian River Lagoon. There are clearly going to be negotiated hurdles that we'll have to sort of figure out. How do you accommodate a nuclear power plant in the middle of your national park? How do you accommodate the national sanctuaries that already exist? I mean, Pelican Island National Sanctuary is the oldest one in the country, would have to be incorporated in some way into the national park. Merritt Island National Seashore is a large national protected area that would have to have some sort. How do you accommodate Space Force in the middle of your national park? These things all have to have dialogue. But I think that we as a community need to move out of conventional thought and start dialoguing with each other and our legislators about the future that we hope to see for ourselves and for our great-grandchildren. So if that has an appeal to you, and if you're interested in moving that thought forward, let's talk about it.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Jim. If you have any questions right now, please take the next few moments to go ahead and write those down. We're going to be sending people around the room to go ahead and collect those from you. Thank you so much, Jim.
Do you have any more questions?
Well, how can someone get involved?
There are people in this room. Nick has got a really cool project that needs volunteers to get wet. The Marine Resources Council is nurturing mangroves, and we need people to get wet to plant those into the lagoon. Virtually every organization up and down the lagoon has volunteer programs that need people to not only get engaged physically, but also to communicate what they're doing to your neighbors, to your HOAs, to everybody else. But take the time to really be accountable for your part in what has become really an untenable set of circumstances for us all living on the edge of the shoreline. Vote, endorse the sorrel tax. It is really doing good work. Contact the IRL NEP, find out what projects are happening near you to get involved with. Act locally, think globally. Sign the clean water petition. It's really vital that the natural systems be recognized as having rights that are similar or equal to human rights, because our future depends on their protection. Right now, you as a Floridian don't have the right to sue an agency for clean water. Right now, there are bills before the legislature that will require you to pay the defendants legal fees if you lose, which means that if you were to take a developer to court, you would have to pay their legal fees if they won. These things are really scary and really chilling to any kind of enforcement of comprehensive planning and any kind of enforcement of land development regulations that will protect your rights as an already existing neighborhood to, reasonable enjoyment of your property. And so insist that the governor veto this bill. It's a really bad bill. Insist that the rights to clean water get on the constitutional ballot next year. And the only way to do that is to sign the petition in order to get it onto the ballot.
Thank you. This question from the audience says, do we monitor marinas and other anchored boats regarding their pump outs?
Yes. They are not almost every municipality has a pump out service. Any boater has to follow MARPOL regulations. They are not permitted to discharge into waters of the state. They are required by law to pump out into a pump out system. They sometimes don't. And they are definitely responsible for a lot of pollution. Think about, I mean, certainly the math has been pointed out that they might be responsible for something like 1,000 septic tanks in terms of the amount of sewage that they can provide in a very small area. But think about how many thousand septic tanks there are. You know, it's important to go after low-hanging fruit. It really is. But it's important also to look at the big picture. And so septic, boat holding tanks are an absolutely easy target to handle, and they should not be exempted from anything. But also look at where their place in the big picture really is. And let's focus on those big ticket, difficult, higher hanging fruit at the same time. We need to learn how to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, guys. If we don't, we're going to trip, right? And that's a lot worse than the practice of rubbing your belly and tapping your head or whatever.
I love that analogy. This question is asking about current dredging operations in the feeder canals and creeks. Do you know what's going on with that?
Yeah, there are several of them. So some of them are muck removal projects, and they are environmentally important to remove some of the muck that is part of this muck flux circumstance that is now being one of the drivers of the pollution in the lagoon. Some of them are navigational, and so after sedimentation happens, the boat traffic has a right to go through. Some of them are just for convenience of dock and marina operations. And I think we need to have better water quality procedures for measuring what components of turbidity are sediment driven and what components are algal driven. And we don't really have a good way to measure that right now. And so, for instance, water turbidity, the measurement of clarity is measured with a Secchi disc. And so we drop a disc that has quadrants of black and white into the water, and we determine when those lines between the quadrants blur. And that's the theoretic, 3 times that depth is a theoretical limit of light penetration through the water. We don't know what component of that is sediments, whether that is organic material, whether those are tryptons, or whether that's tannin in the water. And we don't have a really good way of measuring in the really shallow water what the turbidity is. And so one of the things that we need to do is push, as we replant seagrasses throughout the lagoon, push for different criteria for measuring water clarity. And we need to hold those people who are allowing sediments to move through the water and not have turbidity screens up to do what they need to do to protect our lagoon. I'm not sure that answered the question, but came close.
Yes, at least. This question says, giving the Everglades National Park status didn't do too much to protect it. Why am I considering making the IRL be advantageous?
So the Everglades probably wouldn't exist at all if it wasn't for the national park status. There is a cue bell that the tribes and the national park negotiated with the South Florida Water Management District in order to limit the phosphates into the park to 10 parts per million. So Lake Okeechobee has probably something like 500 parts per million phosphates in it. So one of the reasons that we're not able to move water south is that the park has this cue bell that protects it from over pollution with phosphate pollution. And so phosphates inspire too much growth, and the whole problem that we see in the lagoon would be happening in the Everglades. Part of the problem is that the Everglades isn't getting enough water, clean water, to allow it to thrive. And that's not allowing enough water to get to Florida Bay and the South Florida water, the Southeast Florida aquifer. So the Everglades has been cut up, made smaller, made less efficient, but I don't think it would exist at all if it didn't have national park status. And so it is not a perfect solution to have the IRL be a national park, but it would get funding, it would get international stature. People travel to the Everglades from all over the world in order to see what is a natural wonder. The Indian River Lagoon is also a natural wonder. It has more biodiversity than any other spot in North America. It has unbelievable physical beauty. It has you all as its charming neighbors. It is without question worth saving. And when we love a place, we make it a park. And when we give it the stature of national park status, we elevate it to national stature. And I'm not sure whether that was exactly the answer that that person was looking for, but
Might be. Well, thank you so much. That is all the time that we have for today. Thank you again, Jim,
sure.
for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending.
So as Riverkeeper, I am somewhat responsible for 350 square miles of Indian River Lagoon, not only to monitor it, but to communicate with people. So if you ever have questions that I might be able to help with, if you ever have an observation that needs to be confronted, please don't hesitate to communicate with me directly.